Cosmo, Claire, Page 6, Prevention, New York Times, Boston Globe. She's been a writer and an editor for all the above and more, and now she's a brander. Today on Class Discussion, we meet Ashley Edwards-Walker. So you are an MSU alum, you've gone out, you've done fantastic things, all kinds of fantastic magazines, big name things. Can you help situate Bob and me and our students to where you fit in the world of writing and editing and where you are and what you're doing?
Sure. I right now am a freelance journalist. So I do writing and editing. I've been doing that for about 4 years. What that means is that I write for a bunch of different publications and brands. And my main beat right now is immigration. I've been covering that for a national nonprofit for the last 4 years, and that's kind of my anchor client. And then the other half of the week, I spend pitching and writing various feature stories and interviews, content for other brands and outlets.
So did you start off as a freelancer, or is this something that came along in your career?
No, I started out going for a staff job, obviously. I graduated in 2009, which was in the middle of the last recession, and it was pretty hard to find a full-time job. So I ended up getting an internship at Esquire magazine. That actually came from an internship I had done at the Paducah Sun. I did that between my junior and senior year of college. And by the time graduation rolled around, there was a reporter for the New York Times who was looking for a stringer to cover a case that was happening in Paducah. And they recommended me. So I spent about a month doing that. And then from there, I was able to use the New York Times name to get this internship at Esquire magazine. So I came up to New York for 5 months and did that. And then kind of spent some time freelancing, went to the New York Post and Page 6 magazine, which does not exist anymore. And then I landed a full-time job at Glamour, and I was on staff there for 4 years and kind of moved up the ranks until 4 years ago when I decided to make the leap to freelance. And I did that because I wanted to focus more on writing. When you're on staff at a magazine, you kind of go down the editor path. There are not as many staff writing positions, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I made the jump.
You make it sound so easy. It's like, I did an internship, another internship, and now I'm writing for Cosmo. That sounds like a really big deal to me. So how did you meet the people that you needed to meet, and how did that come about?
It was not easy. There are so many times that I questioned what I was doing. The number one piece of advice I got along the way, though, is persistence. Especially if you're trying to get into national journalism, it feels a little bit like trying to break into acting or something. It's that competitive, it's that challenging. So the advice I was given was just like persistence. And if you keep going and keep doing the work, eventually all the other people are gonna give up and you'll still be there and there will be a job for you one day. And that's kind of how it was for the first 3 years after graduation. The internship was, the New York Times was a huge get for me, and that came from the Paducah Sun. I mean, I would have never imagined I could get a connection from the Paducah Sun to the New York Times, but luckily that worked out. And then I had heard about internships that were paid because I couldn't do an unpaid one. So I applied for a bunch of them, and I somehow got an internship with Esquire. That was a cold email, a cold application. I didn't know anybody. I do think, again, the New York Times name is the last thing on my resume. Definitely helps get my foot in the door there. And then once you have that, then there are editorial assistants who are managing the interns. So once I left Esquire, I kept in touch with them. When I finally moved to New York full time, I followed up with them and I just did informational meetings with them. It was a lot of cold emailing people. I'd go down the mastheads of emails, look for someone who was mid-tier who would have the time to maybe speak with me, reach out to them, ask them for an informational interview where you just kind of ask them where they've been and about their experience and, just put a face to a name. So if something comes up that you're top of mind for them. I was a lot of interviewing. I mean, I interviewed for so many jobs. And then I interviewed with the New York Post, and it came down to me and one other person for an editorial assistant job there. And the other person got the editorial assistant job, but they had a permalance position, which was very big in 2009 when nobody had money, and still is pretty big. and for Page Six magazine. So they had me come on for that. And at first it was kind of a month or two, and then you'd go off, and then they'd have you back when the next issue was going. But in between, I started writing for the paper. I got to do a couple of the front page feature section stories, so that was a big deal. And then I finally had been working to get in the door at Glamour for about a year at that point, and finally got the interview and landed an editorial assistant job. And that was my dream job. So it was a huge deal. It was the most exciting day.
So what can you tell us about your experiences at Murray State University that made all of this possible, or at least help your native talent make all of this possible? What went on then?
Absolutely. I mean, Murray State was a huge help. I knew I wanted to do journalism from the time I was in high school. I did the high school newspaper, so I came in to MSU knowing that I wanted to pursue journalism, and I went out for the newspaper my first semester as a student, and I worked there all 4 years, and eventually worked my way up to editor-in-chief. I spent a semester working at the television station doing music reviews, and I did a year at the yearbook doing some of the feature stories for them. So the clips, I mean, the best experience I had was working on those publications, actually doing it and going through the copy editing process and seeing your name in print. It gave you a feel of what it's really like to work in the industry. And also, this is journalism is a field where you really need clips. You need these experiences, and it can be just from the student publication. I mean, you definitely want to pursue internships, especially like toward the end of college. But you know, you can get a job with clips from the newspaper. So that was a huge asset to me. And just all the classes. I mean, I remember taking the journalism law class. I still think about that when I'm writing stories some of the time when there's tricky issues. And luckily, magazines have a fact-checking department where you can work with someone who can have a lawyer advise them. But having that knowledge going into writing a story helps you so that you're not starting from scratch.
Great, thanks.
I'm kind of curious if we might talk about some of the writing that you've done. And so I have your website pulled up in a browser, and I think if I can just do a share screen here, I'd like to maybe show you a story. Our students will have read it because we'll say, hey, read this story before we get this guest speaker. And I'd love to hear the backstory on a couple of these mini stories that you've written. So here it comes to share screen. So hopefully you guys are now seeing my computer. Are you seeing my computer?
Yep.
I am.
Great. Okay. So there you are. Here's your web page. And I've got, I think, a couple of tabs here. And this one story, let's go to this one first. This one's called Boston Stronger. The Boston Stronger story. And I've almost got it here. There we go. Okay. So actually, this story is pretty amazing. Is this one that you would call a, what would you call this kind of story?
We would call this a well feature. So it's you have different sections of a magazine, and the well is the back half where it's these spreads, where it's 2 stories across. Usually the art is really beautiful, and we do all original photo shoots. You know, you would find your fashion spreads back here, but these are kind of like the big meaty stories that are in every issue.
And where did this one appear? Was this a Cosmo story?
This was in Glamour. So this
Glamour.
was my first big magazine feature. I was an editorial assistant. I think I'd been at the job for maybe a year, if that. And we had pitch meetings pretty regularly. I mean, the frequency changed throughout the years, but usually at least one a week. And for different sections of the magazine. So we'd have a well pitch meeting, we'd have a front of book pitch meeting, that sort of thing. And so part of it is you're just thinking about like what's going to be timely. And when you work in a magazine, you're planning out months in advance. Like in March, you're doing September.
Right.
So it's hard to know what's going to be timely like that unless you're kind of looking at the news a lot. And so anniversaries of things are a big thing. You know, a year after the Boston bombing, people are going to be thinking and reflecting on the events that happened that day. And so that's kind of where my mind was. And Glamour has a specific demo. It's majority young women in their 20s and 30s. some in their 40s. And so I just kind of went through, there was at the time list of people who had survived it on different, local news stories. You rely on local news stories a lot because you're looking for a story that hasn't been told at the national level. And if I'm not in, Iowa and someone went to the Boston bombing and was influenced, I wouldn't know that, So I went through and was looking for people who were in our demo, and I narrowed it down to a list, and I presented those to my top editor, who liked this couple that I had found. And so ultimately that turned into, they flew me down to Texas, and I interviewed the two of them together, and then got to produce that piece. And it was my first big piece. And that's the one that ultimately led to me getting my first promotion to assistant editor.
So this story was your idea, and you pitched it to say, can I do this story? And they bought it.
Yes.
How often does it work that way? Or are you usually assigned a story to do, or do you pitch it, or how does that work?
No, I mean, most of the time you are coming up with your own pitches. So you really have to be creative. You've got to constantly be thinking about things. A lot of times that you'll pitch a story, and then the group will come together to come up with like the right angle or approach to a story, or maybe somebody else was thinking along the same lines. I know another senior editor had been thinking about the Boston bombing, and she'd also been looking. So they kind of like paired her with me so she mentored me through the process, because she was our news director and had done a lot of, interviews about sensitive topics. And this was kind of my first big one about something that was such a big deal. But most of the time it does start with your ideas, unless you have a specific beat, and then in which case you might occasionally get an assignment, like this is the right person for this story. But a lot of times it's you pitching.
The writing on that story is just so strong. You had me hooked at the end of the first paragraph, because here's this couple. They met online. They're both runners. They go to the Boston Marathon. They're both injured in the bomb, and here they are. They're in love, and she's thinking about having her leg amputated. Oh my goodness! So you care about these people by the end of the first paragraph, and I was drawn into the reading of the whole piece. So I can see why you got a promotion out of it. Very, very strong piece, and the photography and everything that went into it. So there was a lot of research that went into this as well.
Yeah, so much research. I mean, before every piece, you just read everything you can find about the people you're interviewing. We would often, actually part of my job when I was an editorial assistant was to pull together these research packets for senior editors a lot of the time. So if they were going to interview a high profile person, we would go to the library and pull all of these old articles and interviews that they had done, anything they'd written before, and you would go through and just read it all. And that's kind of how you inform your question, because you want to let your source know that you're familiar with them and you understand their backstory. Even if you're asking questions that they've talked about before and you need to get on your own record, it's important to let them know you've spent time and done your research before you went to take up their time with an interview.
And this is one that you described as being an article in, did you say WOW, W-O-W section?
Well, W-E-L-L.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, with the well section. Okay. So
yeah.
Then there's this other kind of story that I noticed you had, the told to stories.
Yes, as told to.
As told to. So I've read several that are as told to.
Yes.
Ashley, so where does that show up, and how is that a different kind of writing, and is that something that's pretty common to do?
Yes, it's extremely common today. As told tos are probably the type of story I do the most right now, especially for digital publications. It just does well with readers. You get a lot of clicks on them. And it's essentially a first-person story that you're writing for someone else. So the prep process is pretty similar to any interview. You do your research, and then you go through it. I would say it's one of the more thorough interviews you really have to do, because you're going in chronological order through their whole story. So I've written these for so many people in so many places I couldn't even tell you. But you would start at the beginning of whatever moment you're hoping to capture, and you just walk through and you get a lot of visuals, as if you were writing an essay or something. You want to paint a picture. So you need a lot of detail. Those interviews are at least an hour always. And then you get a transcript, which is something that when I was first starting out, I didn't have transcripts until I started going doing like these longer stories, but you record it and then you can turn it into a company that will transcribe the interview so that you're getting all your quotes accurate. That's important too, to turn in with your materials when you submit your manuscripts, because the fact checking department needs to verify that how you're quoting people is accurate and actually is how they said what they said. So an As Told To is the entire article. It's kind of their quote. But the art is in condensing their story and telling it in a cohesive way, because as humans, when we're speaking, we usually don't speak in complete thoughts. We trail off, we get on a side tangent, and your job is to kind of put it together, stay true to how they would phrase things, their actual voice, but also tell the story in a cohesive and compelling way. And then it's published with their byline, but it as told to. So that's where it comes from. But those do really well and are in high demand all the time.
So we've talked about your writing and what goes into that, but also you're an editor. And so what does that entail? What other responsibilities do you have as an editor? And you freelance as an editor? I would have thought that an editor would have been someone in-house.
Yeah, it usually is. So editing, when you're a freelance editor, it's you kind of fill in for people. So if they go on a maternity leave, if they have a big project that they're focused elsewhere and they need someone to run a vertical, you could go in house for that. I had a long-term editing gig at a career-focused website, and that was kind of, people would submit their own writing, and a lot of these people weren't professional writers, so they just needed someone to offer feedback and kind of shape their piece into like a chronological and cohesive, again, narrative. And a lot of times places want service so that the reader is going to have something actionable they can take away from a piece when it's career focused. So that's something that a lot of people who aren't journalists would not think to do. So it's adding in stuff like that, and you kind of work with them to get the story in professional printing shape.
Let's take a look at one of the pieces that you edited. And I believe this is the one that took you from being assistant to associate editor. Is that, let me see if I can't pull this up here. And that would be, we just looked at this story. Let's take a look at this one.
Yes.
25 years of heroines.
Yes.
Okay.
So this was, I was still on staff at Glamour. This was, my last year maybe on staff. And this is basically a front of book special section. So Glamour did a Women of the Year awards every year. The December issue was devoted for, and this was an anniversary. So we wanted to go back and look at some of the women we had honored in the past years. And so it was going through all the archives and finding who would be right. And you want to think about representation at every level. So that includes like the industries they're in, because we had celebrities, but we had activists, we had scientists, we had people from every industry. You want to think about age diversity, you want to think about authenticity, just everything, so that it feels like a really diverse portfolio at the end. And then we would have to go through, you work with the entertainment team. They're the ones who would connect to any publicist or PR teams and put those out. And then, I would reach out to people who weren't celebrities, and you reach out to their teams and you ask for either new interviews or ask for, a lot of times they're more willing to give like an email quote or something like that. So that's what this mix is, of the short and the long, of getting different people to be involved in it. And then you go through the archives, you pull all the great images from over the years, and just a big project to put together. I think it was 15 pages or something like that.
So is that part of your job as editor? Because I mean, there was some fantastic photography in there and just the right pictures all the time. Was that part of your job?
So I don't take any of the photos. They had a fantastic photo team, but it is your job to coordinate with all the different departments. So as editor, if you need a celebrity, you have to coordinate with the entertainment department. If you need someone from like the news team, various people have their own contacts. So you go through the person who has the contact if they're not yours. And then you go through with the art team and you sit down and you say, these are the images we need. And you go through and select what you think would look best in it. And they also obviously they have the expert opinion and they're weighing in too. And then you all meet with the designer who's designing the section, and you all work together to make a cohesive thing that visually tells the best story, and also through the words tells the best story.
Let me ask you something. You've just raised an important issue. You're talking about working with designers and photographers, people who will give you research assistance. We've talked to people in television and radio who tell us that entry-level folks have to have a wide range of skills, not only be able to write very effectively, but be able to interview, do photography and videography, editing, the whole ball of wax. You're talking about a form of media where the individual jobs may be much more specific. How would you compare the newspaper experience that you had when you were an editor-in-chief with the magazine experience you're having now?
From being editor-in-chief, it felt very, very focused on reporting and working with the copy team. And when I got onto staff as an editor, I mean, you have a top editor and then you have an editor-in-chief. There are two levels generally. I mean, depending on how you move up, eventually you get to top editor yourself, but you're working with those two higher levels of editing, and then all the different departments. Copy is still extremely important, but it was kind of a process. So you would get your manuscript. First you would pitch an idea or present an idea. It would get approved, and you would assign it to a writer, and they would turn in the manuscript. You do your edit. You work with that writer to get it to where you think it's good enough to move up the pole. And then I would send it to my top editor, who would then send it to the editor-in-chief. We would incorporate all their feedback and then have a second draft of the manuscript. And from that point, we would meet with the photography team and the design team to figure out how we're going to visually tell the story. Eventually, you do several more rounds of edits. Eventually, you get to a place where it's in the layout. And once it's in the layout, then that's when the research team comes on and you give them all the backup from the writer. They're going to have the transcript. When they turned it in, they should have turned in an annotated manuscript so that like any data is linked to, or any studies that they reference are provided with it. And they go through and they just verify that it's all correct. So they call people and double check, is this how you meant to say this? It's a very thorough process. And then the copy team simultaneously is looking at the piece and going through and checking. And I mean, thank goodness for them, because there's so many times like issues have come out and they have TKs or just like things that you need that set of eyes. And then there's the production team, who is sort of like the technical aspect. They make sure everything is cohesive throughout the magazine. The same fonts are used where they're supposed to be. The alignment is correct so that the whole product at the end looks like, you know, a cohesive brand.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is, yeah. It's a lot of work, several weeks on every single issue, and you're usually working on 2 or 3 issues at a time. So it's a lot of late nights, and yeah, a lot of hard work, but worth it.
Actually, looking at your bylines and just what you've done, you're totally legit. I mean, you're out there doing fantastic things. And I'm curious about your educational experience. And don't pull any punches here, because I really want to know, what could we have done at Murray State to better prepare you for the career that you are now enjoying?
Well, I had a great experience at Murray State. Again, I loved working at the news and being on the staff, the student newspaper. I think for me, because I knew I wanted to get into magazines and national media, I think a lot of, at the time at least, it seemed like my classes were focused on local newspaper reporting. So there was a lot that I had to learn on the job once I got, and it came naturally, but once I got to New York and started working my way up, there was a lot to learn. A big thing that I noticed was just source hunting. You know, if you're covering the city council and you go to the city council meeting and you can interview the members there, and if someone's speaking, that your sources are kind of contained, or you kind of know who they're going to be, or you're going to the actual event. So those are the people who are there, and that's who you're talking to. But when you're at a national pub, you're often in an office in New York, or, you know, home office or wherever, and you're trying to find people across the country. And these are not necessarily experts. I mean, a lot of the stories I work on are just real people. And you have to think again of representation at every level in terms of age and location and industry and ethnicity and all those things. So figuring out how to find sources in Kansas, when I have been to Kansas like one time, you know, when I was 10 or something, is a different kind of skill. And just thinking about that representation was something that I had to learn. I also think the fact checking process is just, it's really intense in terms of like the annotated manuscript, and just how much you really have to follow up. If, for example, I just wrote a piece on how COVID is impacting people in recovery on their sobriety journey. And there was a case in which a man overdosed. So I can't just say a man overdosed. I have to get the death certificate that confirms he died of an overdose. And his girlfriend who was speaking about him mentioned the text. So like I have to ask for that text to make sure, you know, that it's being presented in an accurate way. And those are things that I hadn't thought to go a deeper level, because a lot of times at the local level, you're interviewing and those are the people, and you can get your records for public records, but it's just a deeper level of fact checking that I learned. And I don't know, you know, if that's something that is specific to national, or if it's just something that any journalist is going to learn the longer they're on the job.
Well, something I think that we've experienced is a lot of students are reluctant to reach out, and they like to research from their computer screen, but actually going out and checking something, there's a little bit of shyness there sometimes. And one of the things I noticed when you talked about, you know, just the trajectory of your career is how many cold calls that you made. That ability to reach out and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'd like to work with you, or I need this information. And so I think that might have worked for your advantage, that your ability to do that in your career, but also that's a skill set that you use pretty much every day, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, that's something I learned at Murray State. We would get assignments for stories and have to go out on campus and like find people to interview. And I remember so many times having that feeling of dread or reluctance to go speak to someone, just walk up to someone. You know, if I was had to interview the university president, you have a meeting, and it's less scary than approaching someone on the street. So I remember doing that a lot on campus, and I think just practice, you get used to it. One of my beats that I had at Glamour when I was an editorial assistant was called Man on the Street. So I had to go out, our office was in Times Square at the time. I'd have to go out in Times Square and Bryant Park and just approach guys and ask them like their opinion on a topic. And I had a photographer with me, so luckily I wasn't completely alone, but it's just something that you just have to make yourself do over and over again. It's a huge part of the job. You can't do this without getting over that.
Actually, as long as we're talking about getting information from people, in this day and age, with COVID-19 lockdowns affecting all kinds of media businesses, you can't have a face-to-face meeting as you might have just last year. Do you see the reliance upon things like Zoom and FaceTime and just telephonic communication? Is your ability to communicate effectively in those mediums becoming more and more important? Are editors going to start not approving the airline travel to Kansas City and say, you can see them on screen?
I do think that for especially for non-cover stories or something that's like an inside story, absolutely. I mean, we've shown that we can do it over Zoom. We've been doing a lot of them over phone for a while, especially for national media, again, because you can't necessarily be everywhere. And I just think like that this is definitely going to be something where it's going to move more digital. Even now when I'm source hunting, like a lot of what I do is like through Facebook. I always think about getting rid of Facebook, but I just couldn't do it. I get so many story ideas from it. I find so many sources on Facebook. I mean, you put out a request for a story and you'll have so many people reach out to you that know about the topic or want to talk about it. So I think social media and for sure Zoom and telephone are definitely going to be a big role, like play a big role in it going forward.
Let me stay with that, but change gears just a little bit. You've done first-person stories, as told to that beautiful piece on Boston Stronger, which is the story of a couple.
Okay, let's time out.
You also said,
time out, Bob.
What am I doing? What am I doing wrong? It's always me.
You did nothing wrong. It's just for some reason the digital hiccup showed up when it was you, and so let's see where we can jump back in. You were just talking about the story on Boston Stronger. You were just talking about that when it.
Yeah, let me start that from the edge, Kevin, and I'm going to shorten that up a little bit.
Okay, so anytime you're ready.
Okay. Ashley, let me ask you about something just a little bit different. You've written some great pieces. For instance, the piece about the Boston Stronger. That's a story of two people. It's very much a first-person story, and has a lot of inspiration to it, a lot of insight. But you also said, I'm working with editors, I'm writing for magazines, and for brands. That sounds to me like you're writing in a way that might be construed. If you're writing for brands, you're sending some sort of a promotional message in your writing. How does that work?
That was what I thought about brand content too at the beginning, but actually a lot of brands are now launching their own content platforms to reach their audience on, whatever their area is. And it's led by editors and writers and journalists. I mean, it's the same process. You interview someone, you use a transcript to write a story, you have an editor who works on it, and then it's published to their platform. And to be honest, it pays a lot better than traditional journalism. So it's a great way to pay the bills, and it's not something that you're selling. I mean, I did some stuff for WeWork, for example, last year, the co-working space, and that was a way, it was used internally to highlight their company, like their employees' side hustles or like hobbies that were cool, and just a way to sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. I worked for WeWork. Can I start over? Is that okay?
Yeah, let's do that. I tell you what, let me change the screen, and we can just pick up with that thought.
Last year, I did some work for the co-working space WeWork, and they were doing a column that ran every week that was a way to honor their employees by highlighting their cool hobbies that they did on the side. So the process is very similar to what I would do for a magazine, in that I interviewed the subject, I wrote the story, I had an editor, and then it was published on their content platform. And it was like, there was a guy who had a pilot license and he used that to rescue dogs. There was someone who had started a jewelry line and had an Etsy shop that was really popular. And that's a lot of what you're writing for a traditional, at least women's outlet. And, the immigration nonprofit that I work for, that's not a traditional media outlet, but they're wanting to highlight immigrant stories, and they have a bunch of data and research. So you're using their data and research. That's sort of the resources. They're supporting you on that. But the interviews are all completely, the same procedure and standards that you would have as a journalist writing for anywhere.
So you would call yourself a storyteller at base. Is that right?
Yeah, I kind of call myself a writer, but storyteller probably captures it better.
I'm curious if it's changed any as far as, looking at what you've written. It looks very magazine, very print publication oriented, that also has a web presence. Do you really see the magazine industry, at least the sector that you're in, remaining something that's very traditional magazine with a web presence, or do you see it changing to something that's more digital as it goes forward?
Oh yeah, I think it's already changed. I mean, Glamour doesn't even have a print edition anymore. It's all digital. Social media is huge for brands. That's a whole other form of the outlet. I think traditional magazines are kind of already dying or gone. And I don't think it's that big of a difference for consumers, honestly, because everybody's already kind of going online to get their news, and they're going through Facebook. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong or how I would like it to be, but that is how consumers are coming to these stories, and they don't need the print copy anymore. As much as I love it, and I love picking up a hard copy and seeing my name in print, like, it doesn't make that big of a difference for the average reader. And I think that brands are slowly adapting to that new normal of where really everything is for digital at this point. And the magazine then takes it and puts it on Snapchat, or they use it over Marco Polo, or however they want to get it out to promote that piece. That's, something they end up doing in-house, but that's definitely the new normal.
From the standpoint of writing, Ashley, Is there a different writing style or feel that you do if something is destined to be on digital first, and that's different from what shows up on the printed page?
I think now it's pretty much interchangeable. I mean, they take your print stories, they put them online exactly as they are. They don't. And then I would say the one thing that I've noticed is a lot of first person stuff does better online. So that's where those as told to comes in. That's why I think those are so popular. People want to hear essays and opinions and as told to. And those, we didn't run as many of those in print. But as far as how we tell a traditional feature, I mean, it's pretty much the same.
Okay.
Where it gets different is social media and how they're thinking about telling a story on their Insta stories or, you know, Facebook or something. They do change it then, but most places have a team inside that will take your content and make it work for that platform. It's not something that I'm doing as the writer of the story.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
What are you working on now? What are the big projects in front of Ashley? What's coming up?
Yeah, so I am still doing the immigration nonprofit. So that is something that I work 20 hours a week on, and it's kind of my anchor client. Anyone who wants to go freelance, highly recommend, do not leave your full-time job until you have 1 to 2 anchor clients. It's the only way to survive the instability of freelance life. But that is a really a great job that I'm really passionate about. It's interviewing immigrants and their allies, just about the role that immigrants play in the communities and just kind of highlighting different pieces of the immigration system. For example, we do a lot of DACA stories. Right now, we're doing a lot of stories about the role that immigrants play in the COVID relief efforts. And we have a research team that has data. And so my job is to find these sources across the country. And some of them are people that have never written an op-ed. And some of them are lawmakers and presidents of universities and who have experience writing an op-ed. And I interview them. I ghostwrite the op-ed for them, basically. And then I send them the draft, and then we work together from there to make sure it reflects their opinion and their views, and it feels authentic to their voice. And then once they are good with the copy, then we send it out to either a local or a national pub to try and get it placed and published somewhere. So that's a big part of my week. And then beyond that, I'm just kind of pitching stories all the time. Like I said, I just had one come out about on, I think last week on Wednesday or Thursday, about how COVID is impacting sobriety. And that came actually from a different story I did a couple weeks ago, where I was doing a FaceTime happy hour with one of my editors. And we were just kind of talking about all the drinking that was happening during COVID. And, on social media, it seems like there's all these memes that are talking about drinking. And it just makes you think like everyone was just overserved all of quarantine or something. And if you're just on social media. And so we were wondering, like, are people really drinking that much? And so we decided just to interview people to find out what their actual habits were. And if they were drinking more than usual, how did they feel about it? Were they giving themselves a pass because this is an unprecedented time? Are they, are they worried about it? Or was it a initial spike and now it's back to normal? So we interviewed, and one person I spoke to during that was someone who had been sober for 12 years. And she mentioned that she really never thought about drinking ever, but the quarantine had made her kind of triggered. And I just made me curious about how everybody in that community was doing. And so I filed the copy for that story, and then I pitched her this other story once I had some research to say that relapse was up. And that's how and then I pitched that story and found sources. And so that one just came out. So now I'm looking for my next inspiration to see what comes up.
Well, you'll get it.
Yeah.
It'll come to you. Let me give you an opportunity. We don't want to take your whole day, because when you're your own corporation, time is pretty precious raw material. Let me ask you this. Let me give you an opportunity to talk to the next Ashley, who may be listening to this video, but is a student at Murray State University. Let me ask you this. Looking back, what would you say to that person who wants to write professionally, who wants to investigate, to tell the story, to express it to others? What should they be thinking about? What should they be doing as a 18, 19, 20-year-old undergraduate now? You've been the whole road. As you look back from the top of the hill here, what can you tell them?
Two things are really important. One is to immediately join the staff at the Murray State News and start applying for internships immediately. I did not do my first, even though I did the paper all through college, I didn't do my first internship until the summer between my junior and senior year of college. I wish I had done at least one more earlier than that. It just wasn't something that I was super aware of. I didn't know anybody in journalism in terms of like someone I could ask about other than my classmates and my professors. And I just didn't know, you know. When I started going for jobs, I was up against people who had at least one more internship than me a lot of the time. So I think the sooner you can get started on that, the better. Also stay in touch with those people. All of my freelance work comes from people that I now have established connections with from various jobs that I've held. So being at Glamour was a great place because in the media industry, people move around a lot. I mean, like 2 years and then they're on to the next job, maybe 1 year sometimes. And so you end up with knowing a lot of people at a lot of different places, and you want to reach out to them and stay in touch as much as you can without being, you know, overzealous. And then the other thing is just to stay curious. I mean, half the story ideas that I've had that have gotten approved and picked up by places, I'll be really excited about an idea and think this is the perfect story, and I'll pitch it and I can't get anybody to let me report on it for them. But I can see something so weird on Facebook or be having, you know, a FaceTime with an editor and a random conversation spins off into a story. So I think sometimes my tendency at least is to overthink a story. And a lot of times what people are interested in, at least for the age we're in at this moment, are these sort of conversational things that seem pretty simple to you. You don't know that it's like a story. And that's a big lesson I've learned, is don't assume everyone knows what you know. A lot of the time, if you're having these conversations with other people, they're going to find it really interesting. And to you, it's just something you already knew and assumed everybody else did. And it could lead to a lot of work as a freelancer.
That's great. Thanks, Ashley.
Ashley, we're very proud of who you are in the world and what you're doing, and you're one of ours. And so thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I think our students are really going to benefit from hearing from what you shared with them.
You know, when I was graduating and we were in the last recession, I was really scared of the job market and not being able to find a job. And that was the case for a while. It did take a couple years. And during that time, I got a part-time job doing retail to support myself while I was also trying to freelance on the side. So I would say that now that we're in another recession, a lot of my former colleagues and peers are getting laid off and jobs are being eliminated. Just to hang in there if you're really serious about pursuing this. I mean, there are a lot of, like I said before, brands have content platforms, and that's a great way to pursue journalism, and they have a lot of money. But if you are really dedicated to wanting to work at a traditional pub, just hang in there. I mean, again, the advice I was given when I was starting out is persistence, and that's what I would say again. I mean, these jobs are always going to exist. They're always going to need good reporters. They're always going to need people to shine light on these issues. And if you just keep doing the work and do whatever it is you have to support yourself in the meantime, you will eventually get there, as long as you're putting in the work and stay dedicated to your craft.
Bob, I learned so much in what Ashley told us, and there was a couple things I really wish I'd asked her to expand upon if I'd realized what it was when I heard it. And one of it was this idea of ghostwriting for people who are publishing in the industry, this branding. What was your take home about that?
Yeah, she's talking about the industry may have a need to communicate a story, not necessarily of interest to the general public, but of importance to the internal public, as our friends in PR would say. Employees, stockholders, families of employees, the people who are going to see a newsletter or check in the way at Murray State we would check in with Roundabout Murray and find out what's going on campus, what's coming up. So there's a big need when you have a large organization to keep everybody informed, not necessarily just about the Christmas party and when factories will be shut down for refitting, not just that, but about the people who make up the organization. And so Ashley's telling stories about those people, the history, challenges that people have. So when she's writing for brands, that is exactly what she's doing, the organization that holds the brand, but we might think of it as writing in the interests of some corporate or organizational entity. But it needs somebody to tell the story. It needs a master storyteller. And in this case, it'd be hard to do better than Ashley Edwards Walker.
So what's exciting about it is she's found a way to take the skills that she has honed as an editor and apply it to industry at large. So suddenly, in this time when you're seeing so many newspapers and magazines do layoffs, she has found an entire new industry where she can apply her trade. That's really an exciting and creative use of her skill set.
Traditionally, that would be a job that would be assigned to the public relations department of any organization. But the PR departments have found that if you find a gifted storyteller, if you find a great writer out there, why not hire them? It doesn't have to be done by somebody who already has plenty of work on their desk and they have to take time out and become a writer for a week. If you can hire it done by the best, why not? You're going to get the best product.
It occurs to me that maybe our JMC department being situated in the College of Business is probably a pretty good fit after all.
It's the best. And we're one of the few accredited departments in an accredited College of Business in the United States, perhaps the only one. And it's a big advantage to all the graduates from our state.